been affected, especially in the area of peace, security, and justice. And as George has presented the slides, when we are in search for peace and justice, the underlying hypothesis is that there are conflicts, because we cannot search for peace and justice if we are not intending to deal with conflicts that exist. So, and I want to give my case when thinking about the African continent. And as we are all aware, many African countries have gone through one form of conflict or the other. And this is despite the fact that a lot of efforts have been put to deal with conflicts generally. There are various organizations, institutions, individuals that have tried to bring about peace and security and justice in African nations that have been ravaged by conflicts of all forms. But despite this effort, we still continue to experience the impacts of conflict. And these impacts have included death, destruction and breakdown of the social fabric due to displacement, the refugee crisis, and generalized poverty. And because of this, according to the UNHCR 2020 report, a very big number of people, close to 82.4 million, have become either displaced people internally, or they have become refugees in one country or the other. And in this 82.4, majority of these people originate from Africa and are also hosted by African countries. Currently, Uganda is hosting a very big population of world refugees. So then, with these conflicts that have been there, and because of these conflicts, there has been various countries that have joined the fragility index that has been designed by the African Development Bank. And of all the countries that are the most fragile, according to the Fragile State Index 2021, majority of the countries that are most fragile are in Africa. So you will find Somalia as number one, South Sudan, DRC, because of the various conflicts related to resources, related to religion, related to marginalization of some people, and others feeling that some people are greedy, and of course here theorizing on the concept of greed and grievance, others fighting because they feel deprived of one resource or the other. Many African countries have joined the Fragile Index as the most fragile. And for that reason, there have been very many efforts to look for peace and justice. And among the various institutions and individuals that have been engaged in the search for peace and justice, governments in every nation have in one way or the other formed either task forces, used humanitarian intervention, used the military to quell conflicts in one area or the other. In Uganda, for example, in the area of Karamanjong, the government of Uganda actually used a lot of resources to quell the increased small arms and light weapons that were used in the fight along the Ilemi Triangle with South Sudan and Kenya. The international community has also contributed greatly to the search for peace and justice. And so you will find the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the USAID, among others, and Oxfam, trying in one way or the other to provide avenues for negotiations, for mediations, and for reconciliation. There have also been grassroots and community-based efforts, where at the grassroots level in Africa, you will find, for example, elders sitting down together and engaging in discussions and dialogues of mediation between one clan and the other, one ethnic group and the other. And so in Rwanda, for example, in 1994, the Gacaca courts that were done by elders, and it was a grassroots effort by the grassroots and communities to engage in peace and justice. Among these also have been non-state actors like religious institutions, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, and Islamic organizations. And each of these has been in an attempt to ensure that there is peace and justice, and that their conflicts are reduced, and that small arms and light weapons that are found in various countries and that move from one area to the other because of the porosity of our borders do not get into the wrong hands. One important institution that I want us to look at this afternoon is the role of the academia in the search for peace and justice. And this peace and justice must be seen in a way that it is sustainable, so it can last longer. So the academia, and one time I want us to reflect on an idea that me, George, and Hippolyte, and I have seen that Hippolyte is here, were thinking about profiling universities in Africa that have courses on peace, justice, conflict, security, and so on and so forth, so that we can see the various researches that have been done, the various universities that have a department that is dealing with peace. And number three, we also wanted to understand or to see whether the peace and justice that is taught in our institutions of higher learning stand alone, whether the courses stand alone or they are mainstreamed in the courses that exist. So our interest was to look at how much research has been done on Africa and in Africa, either by Africans or otherwise, on peace, justice, security, and conflict. And I remember that our conclusion was that there is a lot of literature that exists. A lot of literature exists on Somalia, on DRC, on the Central African Republic, on Kenya, on Uganda, basically every area in Africa. There is a research that has been done by consultants and professors in universities on maybe the meaning of peace, the conceptualization of peace. And there are also a lot of universities in Africa that have a department or a school or a faculty or a course in peace and justice. We also concluded that therefore, there are also many students that are coming from outside Africa, having learned from the West, coming back to Africa to teach in these universities. So I remember our conclusion was the academia plays a very big role. The academia plays a very big role in ensuring that there is sustainable peace and justice in the world, and Africa in particular. And according to because war begins in the mind, it must also be finished in the mind, because war in itself is a construction. Therefore, it can be deconstructed by the same mind that constructed this war. So therefore, our idea was to think also about the concepts that are taught in these universities on the topics of peace and justice. What curriculums exist? How is the syllabus in these universities that teach peace, justice, and security in the African continent? Do we have courses that are also taught at the lower level, such that a child who is coming up can be able to identify with the word peace, can be able to identify with the word terrorism, can be able to identify with the word violent extremism and radicalization, and the concept of human rights, and so on and so forth. So our conclusion, and I remember this is something that we discussed for a long time, was that we needed to send flyers and questionnaires to universities in Africa, Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, and Lusophone Africa, to see to what level are the units in peace and justice taught, and what is taught in these universities. Does it get into the minds of people? So therefore, after we had discussed that, of course, COVID comes. And so now the question was, how is teaching and research and peace and justice going to be affected in the context of COVID? And there was a debate. And I remember we were engaged in a debate in our Department of Peace and Security on the global North and the global South in the context of teaching and researching peace and justice. And one of the things that all of us, especially in Africa, were confronted with is that children and, adolescents and university students, the first phase after COVID is that nobody was even willing to go to school or to colleges. Leave what we were teaching, whether it was mathematics, whether it was English, whether it was any other subject. It was even worse when it came to peace and justice, because in the mind, it was associated with a conflict in itself. So the first thing that all of us went through was fear. That was the first phase during Corona. So because of that fear, the courses that were being taught in our universities or in our tertiary institutions actually took a break. So even if there was a conflict that was going on somewhere and somebody was supposed to research on how to end a conflict in DRC or Somalia or any other place, it was very difficult because of the fear that came with Corona. Nobody was engaged in research at that level. Why? Because number one, you would not move from one area to the other if you wanted to engage in research. So if you were even in a different country, you would not even come back, but still you would not go to the field because everybody, we were contending with the idea of isolation, something that we had never thought about. We were contending with the idea of the fear of death. What if I died and I'm in a different country? And I know we as researchers, all of us had to contend with that. The second phase that came was that there was the issue of acceptance, that Corona is here with us. I remember in Kenya for 9 months, our universities, our tertiary institutions, our primary schools, our secondary schools were all closed down. There was no learning that was going on. There was even no online. There was no virtual learning at all. So it's like all of us went back to where we were. So if you had the energy to learn from the house, you would. But hardly did any one of us even get that energy to mark even the exams that we had because of the fear that we had. So the second phase was the phase of acceptance, what I call acceptance and accommodation. And here people began to accept that Corona was going to be with us for a very long period. Of course, after going through the CNN and the Al Jazeera and all our TV programs that were scaring us of people dying in the US, in Italy, in China, in India, and so on and so forth. So people began to accept. And with this period of acceptance and accommodation that, you could protect yourself against coronavirus, people now began to think, oh, we are students, we are lecturers, we are supposed to be researching, we are consultants. So people began to think about how do you advance? And so this is the period that I call the period of invention. People begin to invent and to think about how can we teach virtually? We can still be in school, we can still be in colleges, we can still hold meetings, we can still discuss peace and justice, we can still research on peace and justice, but virtually. So the challenge was global because very few of us had the idea of teaching or learning virtually. It was even worse in Africa. Why in Africa? Because number one, the resources. the logistics. How many of our students have a computer? How many of our students have an Android phone? How many of our students have even the bundles? Some of them are in the villages. How do you even get to them? So the question of preparedness, mentally, physically, and also the capacity became an issue. The West may have had technological advancement, and so they would still learn perhaps, but the fear and even learning to read, research, train, and teach virtually was a challenge to everybody. In Africa, we had to contend with the idea that majority of our rural areas have no electricity. So even if you had a phone, electricity maybe is there for 1 hour and you're supposed to do research or you're supposed to attend a class. It was not possible for the students to learn. There was also the capacity of the educators, the people that were teaching generally, but in peace and justice, it even became worse. Why? Because for courses in peace and justice, the experimental method is more preferred than the lecturer method, the lecturer-centered method. And what do I mean? Pedagogically, when teaching becomes teacher-centered, its impact on the person that is being taught is less than when such kind of learning is learner-centered, and where the learner actually takes the center stage, actually engages in learning through the guidance of the lecturer or the teacher or the facilitator. So then the question of absenteeism is what we are dealing with actually currently, because a student will be online. I am not sure that all of us who are here today, from what I can see, we are 29. I don't know whether we are 29 listening or 29 online, and the others are doing other things. So the question of whether the effectiveness of delivery was achieved. So therefore, what did this mean? Because of the challenges that we went through, I remember at Kenyatta University and Nairobi University and universities in Kenya generally, the first subjects that were given priority were subjects in medicine, pharmacy. Why? Because the question of health was more important than the question of peace and justice, even where there were conflicts. So peace and justice, education, in whichever level and at whatever level, actually was relegated to the periphery. Courses in education, courses in medicine and pharmacy were given more prominence. So the discussion, even where concepts were beginning to emerge, where issues were beginning to emerge and scholars were beginning to discuss, little efforts were given to discussing peace education, to discuss justice education. These are courses that would require simulations or an eye contact and their emotional needs. So that was not done. That was not done. So then, in terms of research, that is in terms of teaching. In terms of research, for those that were doing research, of course, majority of them could not move from one country to the other because of the logistical challenges that you had to contend with. You needed a K95 or an N95. You didn't know whether if you went to an airport, you would trap the disease and so on and so forth. So even movement became difficult. It was even made worse if you were to travel into a remote area, because the fear was, what if I went to that remote area and a country is locked? I remember we went for some training, and in the process, we were locked in a country. Being locked in that country, we stayed there for 30 days. We would not come back. So you can imagine, even if I was researching on peace and justice, I did not have peace myself. So even if I wanted to talk about peace and justice to anyone, it became very difficult. So what does that mean? The training needs in terms of peace and justice and security became even more constrained, yet there was a need because conflicts did not stop. And I want us to conceptualize conflicts at this level as not the physical fight where people are fighting, because you can also have a conflict that is emotional. The rebels that were in the forest, for example, in DRC and Central Africa, were not thinking about Corona at the time. I remember one time we went to a place and people told us, why do you want us to think about Corona and we are going to die anyway? We would rather die fighting than die in our houses. So really, even the people therefore that needed to be rehabilitated if they were rebels, it became even more difficult. Why? Because even acceptance in the families from where they had come from became very difficult. So then, of course, there are various universities. And I can see that George does not have, but I have listed a number of universities that offer courses in peace and justice. And what I have been trying to gather is how were they affected? Have they still gone back to where they were, when they started, or what happened? Did they start from the beginning or did they start at the middle, and so on and so forth? So of course, this year, I wouldn't say that there is no Corona, because Corona is still with us. But people have started adapting and beginning to change and becoming flexible. But even in our flexibilities, what therefore happens to conflicts that existed physically or emotionally, that were left hanging, that were not dealt with? Do you go back to that consultancy, for example, that you had, or that training that you had, or at what level now do you start? Or even if you had a project that did not have miscellaneous, do you go back to your donor to tell the donor that because of COVID, I was not able to do X, Y, Z, and therefore there is need for us, to rethink about the budget? So then, all of us have realized that the future for research generally is in blended learning pedagogically. Blended learning where you can either do it virtually and mix it with the face-to-face. Of course, this is good for peace education and peace and justice research. But still, we are still challenged, especially in Africa, in terms of capacity. That is number one. In terms of preparedness, in terms of resource availability, because still it's not everybody who has a computer. I am required to teach 2 master's courses, and the students that I'm teaching are in Turkana, and the course that I'm teaching them is arms proliferation. So, and I need to do a lot of eye contact, and I need to understand, because of some of these people that we are training are former rebels. So you need to know whether they have achieved something. I remember I had a program at South Sudan, the Catholic University of South Sudan, and I was training them the pedagogy of teaching peace and justice, especially from a blended learning mode and method. And I can tell you it is not easy. So there's need for a lot of retraining of the educators. There's a need for retooling of the lecturers, and even for those who are doing research, there's need to keep going back and forth with the people that had funded your research, and a lot of capacity building. So for me, peace education, peace and justice education, and research at the same time are still struggling today to go back to where we started. A lot of training that was going on in the boardrooms and in the field is just picking up now. So what will happen to the conflicts that existed that had not ended is still a question that we are contending with. So for me, these are just dots that are still in the process of being finalized. I'm still thinking about it and sending flyers and questionnaires to universities, to schools to tell me how they were affected. And I would really wish to have your comments on the same to help me improve on this small and brief paper. Thank you so much, George. George, are you there?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much indeed, Susan, for this wonderful presentation, brief, captivating, which has taken us actually, through the time of the pandemic, especially at its height. And as you said, that COVID is still around with its challenges. So this is now the time for us to reflect on what you have said. And if you have got questions, definitely we'll ask you. So I'm going now to ask members to ask questions and or make comments, share experiences, because as you know, this was a global pandemic, if I may say so. So please raise your hand if you have got a question or comment to make. Thank you very much indeed again, Susan. Yes.
Thank you, George.
Afiz, wonderful. Afiz Sufiano, please. Afiz, can you hear us? All right. And so Ben Okoth, please, then we go back to Afiz when he's ready. Ben Okoth, please.
Yeah, I'm also very grateful to that wonderful speech or talk we had from Dr. Mwangi. It was great. I also just wanted to point out on peace in terms of citizens and the government. There was conflict amidst COVID on the way the government was implementing rules and regulations pertaining to the pandemic. Actually, it brought misunderstanding amongst the citizens and the police. Actually, like in Kenya, there were cases where people at loggerhead with the police. Instead of fighting the disease, it came to be a realization of fighting fellow humans. Instead of attacking the disease, it was like attacking fellow humans.
Thank you so much for the comment, Ben Okoth. And Afiz, are you ready? And then I will ask Hippolyte.
Thank you very much, George.
And then Moses. Yes, please. Hippolyte. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
lovely.
You, George, and thank you, Susan, for the presentation. I was just wondering, I know your paper is related to academia, but I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about beyond academia down to the community level to explore the disconnects that often exists between what academia does and what is the actual thing in the communities, And by academia here, I'm extending my definition to include institutions that are not necessarily teaching, but which are also involved in research and evaluations for peace. I come to this because of my recent experiences in Burkina Faso and Niger, where I was doing research for the International Food Policy Research Institute and the World Food Program, and we were required to go to the communities to understand what creates social cohesion for them in the context of the work that WFP does. As part of the preparatory work, we were taking through all these IRB requirements and the protocols for COVID-19, and we literally carried boxes of, protective equipment, face masks, hand sanitizers, to make sure that every member that were engaging in the field had access to these things, because we didn't want to take chances. In Burkina Faso, we didn't have too much of a problem, but in Niger, as we trained the field data collectors and came to the point of logistics, and we started bringing out the box and say, okay, look, this is what we need to do, and this is how you need to make sure that everybody you interview has a face, a nose mask. Everybody in the room bursts out laughing. Every one of them in the room bursts out laughing. So we asked them why. And they said, look, if you go into communities with these hand sanitizers and face masks, it is a declaration of hostility. you're basically telling them that they are sick, you don't want to associate with them, and then all the negatives that are associated with. So it's better not to go with them. Now, that was one shock that we had from being a researcher, thinking that we're doing good by bringing these things. The other shock we had was the cost of the unexpected increase in cost of research. Again, from the commodification of COVID-19 by governments. You know, you are required to take a PCR test, you know, and the dates, the durations vary from one country to another. So between Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Niger, I personally took like 6 different tests within a space of 2 months, within a space of 6 weeks. Because every government insisted that you should do what they want, and you have to pay for it. Sometimes you pay extra because they say, oh, you know, if you need it by a certain date, you have to pay extra. So at the end of the day, you ask yourself, of what use is it for me to take COVID-19 test in Ghana, and the next door, Cote d'Ivoire doesn't accept it, I have to take another one. Then I take the same flight to Burkina Faso, they don't accept it, I have to take another one. And the cost at every point keeps increasing. How is one expected to do any serious field research with such kind of a commodification of what is a pandemic? You know, the governments are busy making money out of it with the support of some of the private sector things. And I don't know if you have any experiences on that, Susan. Thank you.
Susan, please, could you respond to that?
Thank you so much, Okoth and Hippolyte. As I said, this for me is not an academic paper, but as a way of sharing our experiences as researchers, as lecturers, as consultants in peace, justice, and security, you know, research. And one of the things that amazed me is the value that we attach to the very practice, not even the theory, the very practice of research in peace, justice, and security. Fine, all of us were concerned that we would be sick. But it was lost on all of us that even when we were in need of masks, nobody thought about refugee and displacement camps. Nobody thought about giving them masks. Nobody thought about giving them sanitizers. We first thought about ourselves. So I remember one time we were sent to Kakuma refugee camp to take masks and sanitizers. And we were telling them about social distancing. And their question was, where are we going to distance? And our houses or our makeshift home is so near each other. We live among each other. And therefore, we cannot even isolate. Even if you tell any one of us to isolate, we cannot isolate as refugees and displaced people. So in Kakuma, I remember we were discussing with UNHCR and World Health Organization, how do you even tell people who are living in congested areas to isolate or to social distance? There was even a joke online. Social media did not even make it better in Kenya and Uganda. And I remember I saw on TikTok a very tall building, a skyscraper, where there were very many clothes that had been spread. So somebody asked, how do you social distance when you are spreading clothes in such an area? Because this is how we are supposed to be living on a day-to-day basis. So really for me, in terms of the experiences that I got in refugee camps, the experiences that I got in displacement areas, and even in urban and peri-urban areas and the slums, the question of having a mask and sanitizing and even washing your hands when you don't have food did not occur at all. The question of even calling your donor who had given you money to engage in a research on peace and justice did not arise because they were scared themselves. I remember when the first sanitizers came and we even used to sanitize our phones, and majority of our touch screens actually at some point lost the, I don't know what you would call it. So you wouldn't use it anymore. So I think the challenges, of course, as much as they were specific to areas, globally, they were almost the same. Because for the first time, all of us were glued on TV. I think majority of us were living in our houses scared. And for the first time, we wanted to live as families together, which was good for all of us. But then, even as we lived together, what we were doing most of the times, there were innovations here and there. People would play cards, people would read a book here and there, but hardly would we even discuss peace and justice and security, because we were watching CNN and people were dying, and we were being told every day, oh, now they have constructed a hospital in Wuhan in a public space. In Washington, D.C., they have constructed. I remember one time I was watching Cuomo until I said, I'm not going to watch it anymore, because it was becoming so stressing, and it became a conflict in itself. Even if I was not sick, I had a conflict in my mind. So for me, the communities that we so much sought to protect, especially as peace and justice practitioners and researchers and educators, the connection that we had with them, like Hippolyte has rightly said, was a connection that you did not even want to go close to that person that you were researching on. Why? One, you were scared that that person may be infected and therefore could affect you. And maybe you are in a country only for 3 days, and then you go back to your country and you are still required to have a PCR. So you don't want to go close to somebody, even if it's a rebel, even if it's somebody that you want to reintegrate in a society. You would not go close to that person so that you are not infected. So even the, what would I say? The close connection, the emotional connection and connectedness that you need when you're dealing with issues of peace, security, and justice, even if you need some information from someone, was not easy. As Hippolyte has said, I remember I went to Zambia and I was doing some research, and the people that I was dealing with, women in some place, did not want to associate with me because they were saying, you have come from out, and we are told that people who are in planes are the ones who are sick. On my part, I didn't want to be close to them because I was scared that maybe if I go and test at the airport at my cost, I am going to be found to be positive and I would not travel back. So yes, the government did not even make it better, because the very communities they sought to protect, they made the pandemic a commodity, a way of making money. So very many people became billionaires. I remember the first mask in my life that I bought it at $100. And for whatever reason, I never wore that mask because I didn't go out many times. So I remember even the one packet of masks that today maybe are going to sell at $0.1, at the time, it was going for $50 and $100. So a lot of people became billionaires in terms of dollars and so on and so forth. So really, it became a political issue, which I call the politicization of the pandemic. It became a political and an economic weapon that was used against the masses. So the issue of even how many people died, whether these people died of corona or they didn't die of corona, for me, is still something that I'm still grappling with, because I mean, nobody was told that when somebody died of the pandemic and they were supposed to be buried in a specific way by a specific number of people, that in itself broke the social cohesion that you would be looking for when you're searching for peace and justice. So that would be my observation, and that was my experience at that level. George.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Susan. There is a question from Afiz. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Lovely. Yes, please proceed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. Mine mostly is Hello, are we still
Hello?
together? Can you hear me?
Yes, but stay close to your microphone, please, so we can hear you. Right, thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. So what is actually the problem in Africa is that when we are experiencing the period of COVID-19, it shows that there are a lot of gap between the primary school level and the secondary school level. There are wide gap between our primary and secondary school level compared to higher institution, because there was no any preparation or any arrangement that will actually encourage us to have our education be running while there is COVID-19. Every student ought to be at home because there is no way to make arrangement for the virtual classes. So even to present, it's really that you find some higher institution in Nigeria. Let me be specific. You cannot, it's really that you find a department with maybe computer rooms, and not to talk about the whole faculty. It is rarely you can find a faculty or department with a personal computer rooms. And this is a way of saying that there are a lot of gap. And for you to even get the laptop, it's so very hard. There is no provision for it in the university. There is no provision for it in the faculty. There is no provision for it in the department, not to talk about the secondary school and primary school level. So there are a lot of disconnection between the technological know-how and learning education with the training of the students or the pupil. So I really actually like the presentation, and it's a way of showing us that we need to go back to what Professor Egon presented to us about non-violence teaching in primary school and secondary school. Because in most cases, what we actually concentrate on teaching is science. We are not talking about the arts courses. It is really today that we are going to find history being taught in primary or secondary school. Just to corroborate and support our presenter, saying that they have not been taught about the peace and justice from the primary secondary school, not to talk about the higher institution. I go through the chart that being presented by our presenter. Is very, very scary. We can actually count the number of universities anchoring and doing the course as a bachelor degree. So there is still need to do more. So thank you. That's my contribution and suggestion.
Thank you very much indeed, Afiz. Would you like to respond to that, Susan, to comment on that?
Yes, George. I remember, I don't know whether it was 2019 or 2018, or it was 2020. I still cannot remember. And me, George, and Hippolyte thought about the state of studies in peace, security, and justice in our universities. And our intention was that we send questionnaires to universities to see how do they teach their peace and justice. And I remember this was after we had gone to Kampala, was it? Yes, Kampala. And we were discussing the state of the art of research and teaching of peace and justice. And in the process of us discussing that, I think either Corona came or Corona was with us. So we stopped the discussion there. So we still need to go deeper to ask at what level our universities and tertiary institutions are researching, are teaching, and even how much governments and international communities are investing in research in peace and justice. Because, as I said, war begins in the mind, and therefore peace and justice also must come from the mind and must also begin from the mind. But if we have populations that are illiterate, the potential for manipulation for such a population in such a community is higher than manipulation of a group of educated people who can engage in critical and creative thinking. So, and I remember, as I said, we also wanted to know, is peace mainstreamed in the courses, or does it stand alone? And if it stands alone as a cause, or as a program, what units are taught in that course, and how much of it is put into practice? Because it is not enough to teach and do research. The most important thing is to practice what you have taught or what you have researched on, and so forth. So for me, the value that we attach to peace, justice, and security education is very low in many African countries. We prefer teaching the sciences, medicine, chemistry, analytical chemistry, biology, as opposed to peace, justice, and education. Yet, the use of biological weapons is very true in our societies. The use of chemical weapons is true to our societies. So for me, really, it is also in the value that we attach to research, to amount of funding, to the pedagogical methods that you use when you're teaching peace and justice, or are you doing it because I remember when MBA, the Masters in Business Administration, was the in thing, and everybody was doing Masters in Business Administration, but not for the sake of anything else, not because they wanted to become good business managers, simply because they wanted to get the papers and get a job. And the explosion of peace studies in many of our tertiary institutions, sorry to say, has been done by people whose interest is not the practice in itself, but on attaining the papers. And so until we appreciate the value of such kind of research, education, and training, then conflicts will continue to be endemic globally in all forms. That's my feeling, George.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I can see that there are 3 hands there. I will start with Moses, go to Hippolyte, and then Janet. And they are all interested in your answers. Thank you so much. Moses, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, George and Susan, for the presentation. My first question is based actually on the comment you made in your presentation, Susan, where you connected the peace, justice, and peace education at university, but also whether the same is happening in schools, so that the children and the youth in primary and secondary schools can identify with peace and violence and other peace concepts. So my question is whether there are some relevant research done during the COVID period that captures the role of peace education in primary and secondary schools. Particularly, I'm aware there are schools in many countries, including South Sudan, where I come from, where pupils and students are being taught peace education through peace clubs and others. So are there research done in this area? What are some of the best practices and lessons that we can learn from to improve our peace education at this level, particularly at the level of the primary and secondary school education? That's my first question. My only comment is, yes, the role of the of the justice and peace education and research during COVID was a bit minimum, just like you said it. But we know even during COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of justice and peace issues actually emerged. For example, in many countries, cases of sexual and gender-based violence drastically increased than any other time in history, perhaps because many of our young ones, they stay at home and they don't go to school, and therefore they had more time in the house, but also in the community. As human beings, we know human beings are social animals. They can hardly live indoors for 1 month. It's difficult or even impossible. And therefore, family members, particularly young ones, started going out, like socializing, even despite the restriction. They can move from a house to house, and we know cases of like pregnancy happen among particularly teenagers. It has happened. So such kind of situations, in my view, actually calls for a research, but also calls for justice and peace education, so that during pandemic, we need to draw lessons. We never know, because in the past several decades, we know almost after every 1 year, a new pandemic emerges. Therefore, we need to draw lessons from what happened during COVID-19 so that we can document them, so that future generation can also learn from what happens during pandemics. So that's actually what I would like to put in, just as an idea that perhaps needs to be explored. Otherwise, I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Moses. And Susan, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you so much, George. And as I said, this is a way of sharing experiences. And that is why you can notice that there's not a lot of theory that has gone behind, because this is a way of sharing our experiences on what happened. And I remember when we started this with George, I think we thought about this topic last year, George, if I'm not wrong. And our interest was just to engage in people talking about, today we are not discussing the pandemic anymore. We had a meeting last week with universities in Kenya. And now the question that we are asking ourselves, was the pandemic a form of conflict in itself? A mental conflict in itself? We all know that it existed. But was it a form of biological or any form of weapon that was put on all of us? So that in itself, it becomes a subject of study in peace education. I remember when we were discussing with Hippolyte and George on what form of education should be given and at what level. And we were saying, why is it that we want to begin teaching peace education or peace and justice education at the institutions of higher learning? Yet, a young mind at the formative stages, according to psychologists, is better positioned to understand, associate, digest, and uphold the values that we teach them at a young, tender age than when you teach them when they are big. Our small children that we have, when we tell them, don't touch this, it's going to burn you, they don't go there anymore. But when they are big, even if you tell them don't, as the last speaker has said, our young generation cannot stay in a house, and even if they are in a house, they are on a phone. They are playing games and so on and so forth. Why is it that we begin teaching peace education in many countries? And that was our interest. We wanted to understand, in the African context, how much of peace and justice education is done at the primary school level, at the formative ages, where the propensity of that child to understand and to uphold what they have learned at that stage will stick to them than when you teach them when they are big and they understand what conflict is. Electoral violence, for example, when our children are born and we start telling them in an African context, for example, I come from this community and we don't like this other community. I come from this clan and we don't like this other clan. They have done this. Or, you know, we have, if you talk for the case of Ethiopia, the conflict in Ethiopia today, which is being presented as an ethnic conflict, yet we know it's not about ethnic conflict. It's much more than ethnicity. It is issues related to governance. It is issues related to the role of the international community. It is a war between the global north and the global south as they fight for control of resources in the African continent. Why is it that we cannot teach our children at a tender age so that just like they understand Pythagoras' theorem, because all of us here understand Pythagoras' theorem, never mind, we don't even know. Maybe as a historian, I can give you the history of the Pythagoras theorem, but I cannot tell you when I was young that I understood anything about peace, justice, and they don't even understand what is transitional justice, what is retributive justice, and so on and so forth. They don't even understand that there are alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, because what we have taught our children from an early age actually negates the very practice and the very theory that we teach them about peace and justice. When we were in this conference, I remember somebody came up with an idea that what we find in our books is the definition of a family. And how do we define a family? We say a family is father, mother, and children. Yet, there are various forms of families that exist. There are child-headed families, they're all grandparents-headed families, and so on and so forth. And that is where we begin to teach our children, how do you deal with violence when it occurs? How do you resolve a small conflict? And for me, peace and justice studies must begin at the formative stage. The pedagogy of teaching may be different from one person or from one country to the other. But in terms of the content that is supposed to be taught, I still think that, and this is subject to debate, I still think we need to research, to have questionnaires that will tell us at what level are we teaching peace and justice, and therefore what needs to be done and by who. I think that is important. I don't know whether, it's not a response that I'm giving, I'm just sharing my thoughts on the same. George.
Thank you so much, Susan. You are doing well. And now, Hippolyte, please, and then Janet.
Thank you again, George, for the opportunity. The research that Susan kept referring to was actually conducted under the leadership of George, and Father Bill Headley, who is on this call, was part of it. I recall that we were trying, as we struggled, all the issues that Susan raised were right. One of the things we're trying to do is, how do we help the universities, and these were the member universities of the Association of African Universities for the Catholic Church, how do we help them synchronize, curriculum and make sure that they're all pulling in the same direction? Unfortunately, after several months of pushing, we got less than 10 responses. Less than 10 responses from all the universities in Africa. So I was a bit surprised to see the list of universities on the slide that are teaching peace in Africa, with a good chunk of them being Catholic universities. And yet we had very few responses. So that raises a question. To what extent are the institutions that we're talking about here as the bedrock for peace education, to what extent are they interested in engaging in the discussions that can create contextualized, responsive courses for the continent? That's a question that I don't expect Susan to answer, but it's a question that is open to all of us. If the institutions are not willing to engage and answer basic questions and help us think through how we can pull our efforts together, where are we going? That's the first question. The second question that I was thinking through is yes, COVID has come and gone, but it has taught very important lessons. And I'm just wondering how the universities, and for that matter, everyone engaged in peace research is taking that in. One of those lessons that I see is that in the case of the security, health as a security issue in Africa, we saw all the challenges that went with the vaccine wars, vaccine diplomacy, and the exposure that COVID gave to the fragility of health infrastructure in Africa. We used to see that a lot under Ebola, but we thought it was country specific. COVID now made a continent-wide issue where we begin to see the fragility of the health institutions across the country. And that is a security issue for me. How are we taking that into consideration in evolving a new concept of peace that includes the ability of states to prepare for and deal with emergencies, pandemics such as this, knowing that they may have to rely on their own laws and not expect international community to rush and help them when they have their own problems to deal with. So how are we dealing with that issue? The second dimension of COVID being a security issue is, at least in West Africa, we noticed that during the lockdowns did not affect the armed groups that were moving between borders. And in fact, the lockdown allowed some of them to reorganize and permeate borders across and penetrate to places where they would otherwise not have been able to get into. The question becomes, how is our understanding of health pandemics such as COVID a factor in developing our conception of peace and security in Africa? What is it that we need to learn? What lessons can we learn that help us understand that health is a security issue? Health is a security issue because of our infrastructure, state of our infrastructure, which requires investments into it. It's a security issue because it creates opportunities for armed groups to infiltrate, leverage the opportunities that exist, and do what they want to do. So the question becomes, are we thinking about this? Thank you.
Thank you, Hippolyte. Susan, any comment on that?
George, I think I agree totally with Hippolyte. When we discuss the 7 security sectors, and health is one of these sectors, one of the things that have become a securitization issue is health, because I remember one time when we were discussing which areas should be given masks and others should not be given masks. And somebody commented, we need to retain the masks that we have, because if we take them to another country that is at war, those people are more concerned about war than they are concerned about wearing of masks. So that is like engaging in a war in itself, or helping the rebels. And I said, one of the places that we went to, and we wanted to train people that were to be reintegrated into society, it was very difficult because the rebels did not care about movement. They were moving from one area to the other. And something very interesting happened. We went to a country and we were told that the group that was supposed to do some data collection in an area left because the data they were going to collect was from a group of rebels that had voluntarily agreed to talk. So in the process, one of the rebels coughed and everybody left. For them, they are not worried at all. They can move from one area to the other. But for the researchers and for the donors, they will even keep reminding you, don't go to such and such a place. There's a travel advisory on such and such a place. So for me, I agree totally with Hippolyte that health and security are directly related. And we need actually to reconceptualize to theorize on the areas related to health, pandemics, and security, and even the question of justice. Who receives masks, how and where? Because that in itself, the question of injustice came in that context. So I agree with you, Hippolyte, when we were thinking about, having questionnaires for the Catholic universities to see the extent to which our Catholic universities are engaging in teaching, training, and research in peace, it was to see how can we perhaps mainstream peace and justice studies in majority of these institutions that we have.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Susan. Now, Janet, please, we've been waiting for some time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you, Suzanne. Susan, and all the comments. This is such a rich discussion that I almost feel like I have an article of notes written down. And so what to say in my limited time. One is, this is brilliant point, Hippolyte. This is a brilliant point, and Susan, of connecting health, security, and pandemic, because it has to do with human life and human vulnerability, and how do we value it? In war, people are cannon fodder, or, people are killing each other. People are setting themselves out for death anyway. And so why do they care about masks? And contrast that to families or urban situations where people are not nomadic, but they're settled. They can't go away. We're in New York City, where I'm from, we're stuck here with each other. And, except for the people who bought new cars with their extra disposable income so they could drive away from the city. But okay, so human vulnerability and how we value life is the first point that's really relevant, I think. And then I want to connect to Betty Reardon and the idea of peace education, my mentor and colleague, that we were this concept of edu-learner. So how is the educator or the organizer of educational programs not just someone who stands aside and observes, as we often do in our research programs and our research plans, but for example, with participatory action research, participatory action research is another resource to engage with the people you're working with, not just stand aside and look, so that the problems of the researchers are so disparate from the problems of the people being studied. So that's, someone could make a talk on that. Then I really, Susan, I really loved the list of the 4 ways you went through in the beginning of your talk, which I may not have written down absolutely correctly. But first is the crisis, and everybody freezes because truly no one knew what to do and what was going on. And in COVID, like in New York, the ambulances were going 24/7 and the bodies were piling up. They had, they were just piling up all over the city. And who is getting sick? And, they weren't treating it. They learned so much in action. So I guess that was a kind of tragic participatory action research. But okay, so everybody freezes, everybody's afraid, everyone stays home. And then people begin to move out in various ways. The adaptions, the medical possibilities come. And I want to highlight 3 things that I saw. Okay, there's a crisis. And what is our social responsibility? The crisis reduces what we think we're doing. Like I was supposed to go to conferences here in Germany and this and that. Instead, I'm locked in my apartment with my husband who is sick, who can't even have surgery because, you know, everything's shut down. So we are locked in our little pod and not even seeing our family 10 blocks away because that's the first, best, dumbest. The first thing we can do is the dumbest thing. Don't move, you know, watch, observe, wait. And then what is our social responsibility when we started going out? It's thinking of how we affect everyone. So it was really, I mean, I suppose in New York, we have our gangs too, and our not pervasive, but pods of, or whatever, violent conflicts. And you could see certain people were like, no, I'm not wearing a mask, you know, I'm not going to get COVID or whatever, you know. So there are always these resistant groups. But what's our social responsibility? And then I love this idea of innovation. So, okay, when we started visiting our family, we're fortunate to live near a lot of park, a river, and so we would meet them in the park. We were even now, people aren't going into each other's houses. And so, okay, what are you going to do with these wild kids, my grandchildren, who can't go to school? Well, we observed geese laying eggs. We observed squirrels and fed them, and they got to know us and, you know, try to sit on our laps or something. We observed all the kinds of trees in the neighborhood. I found places around me that I had never seen, even living here for 20, 30 years. So we were learning science. We were doing cooking. We were learning measuring with, you know, and because we had a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, you know, who can do which tasks. So the idea of an intergenerational society was one of the things that COVID forced us to focus on, and how to deal with the differences. My grandson cannot run into his grandfather and knock him over, you know, because, you know, we have to learn those sensitivities. Okay, so innovation coming from observations. What's around us? Like, because everyone was ordering through delivery, we made tons of projects with cardboard. What can you do with cardboard? You can paint every week with cardboard, or you can draw, or you can cut it up, or you can crawl inside it, or you can make houses or whatever. Okay, adaptions. That's, of course, New York City, where we have delivery. And adaption and flexibility, it's so important because as Pema Chodron says, when things fall apart, we still are here, hopefully, and we try to live and we try to let go. So what is the innovation, the creativity? How can we allow this? And of course, you all, many of you speaking, work in institutions. So it's pretty hard. But I think what I'm circling back to is our context, our environment, the nature, the family. We can keep going back to peace education, thinking institutionally and back to the family. And so one of the things, okay, the last thing I have to say is, sorry, so long, is that, so what I've done, I thought of this actually, you know, after I finished my dissertation and I didn't go to work in the university, or whenever the university ended for me, that it was to make circles, learning circles with people near. Of course, with Zoom, now I have learning circles like this, where I'm learning an enormous amount. So we can keep balancing the informal and the non-expensive and the non-government regulated and funded with the resources that are at our fingertips. What are they? And these need to be integrated. Thank you for, you see that everything everyone said, and your talk especially, Susan, and was incredibly inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. And Susan, please, your response or comment on that.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you so much, Janet. I think it was not a question, it was a comment. But I think the one interesting thing, and I don't know whether it happened in other countries, is about how the question of health also became politicized, and that reflecting on our vulnerability emotionally, because I have always asked myself, what is going to be the future of a generation in Africa that does not know how to shake hands? Because we were told that we are supposed to fold our fists. An African context is where you shake your hand with somebody. So what happens to such a generation? And what also happens to a generation where people knew that staying alone was the most important thing? That was their first learning, and first formative years are very important for the future of peace and security in Africa. That is something that I have been grappling with, on what kind of generations. We are saying that COVID is over, but what are the impacts of those 2 years that have been years where children that were born during that time learned things differently than they have always been learned? I think for me that has been important. Then there was the issue of the edu-learner. I remember we were doing a course with the Commonwealth, Extend Commonwealth. And the issue is that the lecturer of today or the educator of today cannot just engage in education per se. That person becomes a facilitator. You facilitate. So you're also learning as your learners are learning. And of course, it hasn't been all bad or all gloom for all of us. We have learned, we have adapted, we have become flexible. We now can meet here because of the pandemic. I remember George one time said, I am thinking of having something virtual where we can be engaging in talks. And I remember when George started, it was, let us have this presented next week. And then now it has become a series. So there's so much that we have learned and we have achieved, and that is good. But the future of these 2 or 3 important years globally are only going to be experienced, perhaps not now, but in some time to come. There is both good and bad that has come out of it that we need to pick as good and best. What can we learn from it? And what is it that we need to leave behind and to move on with? I think that is what I would say, George.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Susan, for these wonderful, responses. And really, it's about time now that we postponed this webinar till next week. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Susan, for this inspiring presentation. And I would like to thank also everybody for your participation. As always, you've been amazing. And I'm just looking forward to meeting you next week. And as you know, we are now collecting all these presentations. We are asking our speakers to put them in a book chapter form so that we can have a handbook with all these wonderful presentations. So I'm sure that we'll have one from Susan, definitely from Janet, from Hippolyte, from Egon, from Bill, and the rest, because I know that you've already made your presentations. And of course, we welcome future presenters. So thank you very much indeed. Have a nice day, a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, George.
Bye-bye, Susan.
I don't know how to leave.